You are a blacksmith in a faraway land. While others work with iron or bronze, you work with magic, and your swords are prized throughout the land for their supernatural abilities. One day, a knight visits you. He places a heavy bag of gold coins upon the counter and asks,
"Can you make me a sword that can kill all of my enemies?"
Of course.
You reply, for this is easily done.
"Can you make me a sword that can kill only my enemies and no other living thing?"
There is nothing simpler.
You reply,
"Then make me a sword that can kill all of my enemies and only my enemies, so that I will not harm a hair on any ally's head during battle."
and with that, he departs. You toil at your forge every day for 3 months, shaping the blade, weaving arcane forces into the metal, and exorcising any imperfections, until eventually you are left with a magnificent weapon. When the knight returns, you place the sword down before him. He examines it, then, satisfied, gives you the remainder of your payment, before mounting his horse and riding away. You never see him again. Yet, as he leaves, a tremor of nervousness passes through you. For you know that the sword you have made for him can either kill all of his enemies, or kill only his enemies, but not both. Worse still, without calling upon magic beyond your control, there is no way to determine which. For, while administering the magic imbued within the blade, a prophecy revealed itself to you. A prophecy older than time, written in the language of reality, which states that any magic sword of this kind must necessarily create its own downfall. For there exists someone in the world, be they man, woman, or otherwise, who, if they are your enemy, cannot be killed by your sword. And if they can be killed by your sword, then they are not your enemy.
Part 0. Introduction.
You don't have to be Logic Ian to watch this video. Wait, sorry. You don't have to be a logician to watch this video. As long as you're interested and you have a baseline familiarity with mathematics, you should be able to get something from this. There will be logic involved, quite a lot of it at some points, but when that happens I'll do my best to include both technical and higher level descriptions of the material, so that everyone can get something out of it. You also don't need to watch this video all in one go. I'm quite aware of its length, but everything in here needs to be in here for us to appreciate the conclusion. For that reason, I've broken it up into chapters, so feel free to stop and start as you like. I won't hold it against you. This video, as the title card would suggest, is about a rather esoteric field of mathematics called formal logic. I'll talk at great length later about what exactly that is, but for now it just suffices to say that it's probably the most abstract discipline in all of mathematics. And for that reason, even professional mathematicians might find a gulf between their regular work and the stuff I'll be talking about. Indeed, it's so abstract that it actually strays closer to becoming philosophy at points, in that we are analysing modes of thought and how humans are likely to conceptualise arguments. There is actually a whole discipline of logic called philosophical logic, which aims to analyse logic from a philosophical perspective, but for now, given that this is the summer of maths exposition, we'll be sticking to a mathematical treatment of logic, except for right at the end, when I might indulge in a little philosophical speculation, because no one can stop me. I've also included the patent-pending MathPunk Danger Meter, which will appear periodically throughout the video to tell you how tough the going's going to be. It goes all the way from dark green, meaning hopefully not too bad, to red, meaning weapons-grade mathematics. I hope to stay out of the red zone for as long as possible, but regrettably there will be some dalliances into it, because this is some heavy stuff we're dealing with. This video will be a slow burn, and we'll be making several detours along the way. I would encourage you to watch the entire thing, especially if this is your first introduction to logic, because everything will be in play by the end, and I think you'll like the conclusion. A question I get asked surprisingly often is
Part 0.5. What is pure maths good for?
Right, yeah. Because if you're an engineer, or a politician, or a journalist, or something else, then the work you do has a tangible effect on reality. Engineers build things, politicians represent people in democratic power structures, or at least they're supposed to, and journalists distill complex ideas down into digestible products for general consumption. When I tell people I'm a mathematician, they often assume, correctly in my case, that I study pure mathematics. But what exactly is pure mathematics? Well, to paraphrase one of my favourite books of all time, a pure mathematician is someone who goes to their office, sits down at their desk, and spends all day thinking about the question, what is 3? While this isn't strictly true at all, it captures quite well the distance between pure mathematics and some of the more applied disciplines, like fluid dynamics, information theory, or statistics, all of which definitely have pure aspects to them, but it's fairly obvious how they can be applied to the real world in a way that pure mathematics can't. So, what good is pure mathematics? You know, thinking about numbers all day, what good's that going to do? I can think of several possible responses to this question, only one of which includes a swear word. They range from the practical to the uber geeky. I think we'll start with the practical answer. To adapt a Monty Python quote, aside from architecture, transport networks, agriculture, modern medicine, manufacturing, automation, communication, and the internet, what's pure maths ever done for us? Much of the applied mathematics, which is directly useful, is grounded in centuries of pure mathematics research. To give but one example, modern-day cryptography, which is what allows you to shop online without your credit card information being stolen, simply would not exist without the pioneering number theory work of G.H. Hardy, a man who once said, quote, "No discovery of mine has made, or is ever to make, directly or indirectly, for good or ill, the least difference to the world." Without him, we wouldn't have Facebook, or Amazon, or Apple, or... Also, pure maths isn't just about numbers. This is more of a nitpick than an actual response, but it's common to conflate pure maths with number theory, when in reality, number theory is just a small part of the much broader field of pure mathematics, which also includes things like abstract algebra, analysis, set theory, subjects where the appearance of numbers tends to be met with surprise and or suspicion. Moving to the geekier side of things, the fact that mathematics is such a good model of reality poses a super interesting question. Is reality maths? In the opening of this video, I indirectly called mathematical theorems prophecies older than time, written in the language of reality itself. But is this true? Is the universe maths? Or is maths just a model we've created to describe the universe? In other words, is mathematics created or discovered? There's far too much behind this question for me to unpack here, so I'll shelve it for now, but maybe give it some thought. I've been thinking about it for years, and I still can't find a good answer. Either way, understanding mathematics is key to understanding the way the world is, pure maths and all. The study of mathematics as a philosophical concept is called meta-mathematics, and it's here, in these hallowed lands where mathematics and philosophy walk hand in hand, that we first brush up against our hallowed logic.
Part 1. Axiomatic Systems.
what is an axiom? An axiom is something we assume to be true, which we can use to deduce other things. An axiomatic system is then any mathematical field which has axioms. Perhaps the earliest known example of an axiomatic system was the geometry created by Euclid in the 300 BCs. He attempted to pin geometry down into as few statements as possible and use those statements to show every other geometric property from them. Euclid's axioms were as follows. The first axiom is that a line can be drawn from any point to any other point. Axiom 2, a line can be extended to infinity. Axiom 3, a circle can be drawn with the same length as a line segment. Axiom 4, all right angles are the same. Axiom 5, if two lines are drawn which intersect a third in such a way that the sum of the inner angles on one side is less than two right angles, then the two lines inevitably must intersect each other on that side if extended far enough. Now, the fifth axiom caused Euclid quite a bit of trouble, and in the intervening centuries, many people tried to get rid of the fifth axiom, because it seemed unwieldy and unnecessary, and it wasn't in keeping with the elegant beauty of the first four. And eventually, people realised that we don't need the fifth axiom. You can't prove it from the other four, but there's no reason to assume it. You can, if you want, assume the opposite. And as soon as people realised that, whole new fields of geometry opened up, called non-Euclidean geometries. Perhaps the two most famous examples of non-Euclidean geometries are elliptic geometries and hyperbolic geometries. Elliptic geometry is the geometry of a sphere. Instead of the fifth axiom, we say that if two lines in elliptic geometry are perpendicular to a third, then those two lines must intersect. A consequence of this is that a sum of angles in a triangle will always be greater than 180 degrees. It's used a lot in planes and GPS and anything where you're having to deal with 3D spheres or ellipses, whatever. Hyperbolic geometry, on the other hand, is very weird. Lines curve away from each other instead of running parallel to each other. And this means that the sum of angles in triangles are always less than 180 degrees. Always less than 180 degrees. This has a lot of really interesting uses in special relativity, for example, but it doesn't very accurately describe the real world, so we never really come across it. I think I have a diagram that can explain it. Let me just move everything out of the way quickly. Yeah, okay, there we go. So around the time people began to realise that Euclid's axioms were malleable in some sense, there was a big drive for formalism. We had the analysis gang of Weierstrass, Cauchy and Bolzano. We had group theory being studied by Abel and Galois. And so people began to ask, can we do the same for arithmetic? That is there a single set of axioms from which we can derive every single truth of arithmetic? And the answer was very complicated.
In order to answer this, mathematicians were going to need new and much more powerful tools. The way mathematics was conceived of in the academic sphere was about to change forever. And with that, I think it's finally time we get formal.
Part 2. Formal logic.
Who said that? Despite my appearance, formal logic is called formal because it deals with laws of form, i.e. the structure of arguments, rather than the content of the arguments. To give an example of this, when I was a kid I had a jumper from Next, which had the logo across the chest. the letters N, E, X, T. And my mum used to point at the letters, each letter in turn, and say N, E, X, T. Then one day, when we were out walking, we walked past a stop sign, an English stop sign that says S-T-O-P on it, and I pointed at the stop sign, at each of the letters in turn, and said N, E, X, T. And my mum looked at me with a glint in her eye and said, "What a dumbass." Of course she didn't really. My mum's lovely. Instead, she realised that I'd picked up on the form of the sign, the 4-letter pattern, rather than the actual content of the letters of that pattern. And formal logic is about studying those kinds of patterns. Formal logic can be thought of as an attempt to find every kind of argument and break them down into their forms. As you can imagine, there are many different kinds of argument. And so logicians have come up with a series of tricks to help them find each one. And we're going to look at some of those tricks in this video. We'll start with perhaps the simplest idea of a logical argument, that of A-B reasoning. So the idea is that if we have A and we have A implies B, then we get B. An example of this might be, it is raining. If it is raining, then I will get wet. Therefore, I will get wet. Don't be intimidated by the fact that we're using letters to represent sentences, by the way. In the example I gave before, the letter A stood in for it is raining, and B stood in for I will get wet. Because we're only interested in the form of each argument, we want to generalize as much as we can, and the way we do that is by taking abstract sentence symbols, in this case letters, and letting them stand in for specific sentences in an argument. Thinking in these terms gives rise to
Part 2.1. Propositional logic.
Can you guys hear that too? Anyway, interruptions aside, yes, we get a system called propositional logic, or zeroth order logic. Propositional logic arose as a way to deal with arguments whose constituent sentences can't be broken down any further. So, it is raining, for example. I will get wet. Both of these cannot, in our argument, be broken down any further than themselves. However, the sentence, if it is raining, then I will get wet, may be broken down further by use of a connective. If then is an example of what's called a binary connective. It's called binary because it has 2 input values. In our case, the input values are it is raining and I will get wet. Putting these together, we get if it is raining, then I will get wet. There are other kinds of connectives as well. Let's think about this slightly more complicated case. I am late to work. My boss has not had her coffee. If I am late to work and my boss has not had her coffee, then I will be shouted at. Therefore, I will be shouted at. Another example of a connective is or. We could just as easily say, if I am late to work or my boss has not had her coffee, I will get shouted at. Therefore, I will leave my job. It's not a valid argument. I don't know why I said that. For now, I think it's time we start to formalize properly. So let's move over to the whiteboard and I'll start laying out the good stuff. The system we define here is going to be based on Gerhard Genson's system of natural deduction. It consists of 4 sets. Oh, and I'm sure some of you are wondering why it says hoopla here. The answer is, I have tried so hard to rub this off, but it's not coming. So for now, we are stuck with hoopla logic. Anyway, hoopla logic consists of 4 sets. 1, a set of, talk to the microphone. 1, a set of propositional symbols. These are our A, B, C, D, E, F, G. The letters we are using to represent individual sentence fragments. The ones that I said earlier can't be broken down any further. We're never going to need more than 26 of them, but if you do, here's how you do it. You write A, 1, bottom index 1, A, 2, bottom index 2, A, 3, and so on. So in our earlier argument, it is raining and I will get wet are both represented by propositional symbols. But we're not dealing with their meaning yet. We are only considering the symbols. Meaning will come later, trust me. Next up, we have our set of connectives. These express relationships between sentences, and we give each one its own special symbol, so we don't have to write out each word in full each time. Now, in logic, we like to represent abstract sentences by Greek letters. So these are our propositional symbols, but sentences are something slightly different because they include connectives. Again, we're going to rigorously define sentences in a moment, but for now, all you need to consider is basically we can put propositional symbols in place of them, and we'll go from there.
Hey, it's me from the future, here to say I made a huge mistake when I recorded this part, which was I started to talk about meaning. Now, we don't want to talk about meaning yet, so I've edited out all the parts of me talking about meaning. This means the next section is going to be a little jagged, but hopefully everything will come to light eventually, okay? Cool.
We have and symbol or implies, if and only if, and not. This only takes one sentence as an argument, whereas the others take two. This means that this is what's known as a unary connective, whereas these four are all binary connectives. Next, we have our set of axioms. As discussed earlier, these are things we assume to be true for the sake of the system. We don't actually have any axioms in this system, because the axioms are kind of given to us by the inference rules for certain connectives. This is kind of a technical detail, so I'm going to gloss over it here because it's not hugely relevant. All that matters is that we have an empty axiom set for this system. And finally, fourth and sexiest, we have the inference rules. If the propositional symbols and the connectives are the Lego bricks of logic, then these are the instruction manual. They tell us how we can combine sentences together by adding or removing connectives. There are too many for me to list on this board, so as I keep saying, I'm going to put them on screen now and you can pause and read them at your leisure. Some of them get pretty technical, so don't blame me if you don't want to engage, that's fine. You won't need to know specific details of the inference rules for the system to enjoy the rest of this video, so have at it if you like. When these four sets combine their powers, they form what is called a deductive system, or, somewhat confusingly, I've also seen it referred to as a logic. Logic refers to the broad overarching field, a logic refers to a specific instance of sets of these things. But I think that's fairly uncommon terminology, I just quite like it. But we're not quite done yet, because we still don't have a way to reliably generate sentences. We do this using three rules. Number one, every propositional symbol is a sentence. Number two, if phi and psi are sentences, then so are all of these. So basically you can put two sentences on either side of a binary connective and you'll always get a sentence. And three, most important rule of all, nothing else is a sentence. Not even life. Sentences defined in this way are often called well-formed formulae, which is often abbreviated to WFF, which I'm going to pronounce as woof. Finally, a proof of a sentence phi in our system consists of a set of woofs psi 0, psi 1, psi 2, ... all the way up to psi n for some number n, such that psi n is equal to phi, the sentence we want to be proved, and every woof in the set is either an axiom, an assumption, which is something we take to be true for the sake of the proof, or can be deduced logically from other members of that set using the rules of inference provided.
That was quite a bit of work, wasn't it? If you glazed over slightly, don't worry, I'll go through an example to show you what I mean. Let's take the theory with connective and, axioms A and B, and inference rule, if phi and psi are sentences, then so is phi and psi. It's a standard introduction rule for and. Using this, if we assume C, can we deduce A and B and C? Yes, we can. Here's how. First, we take from our axioms A, then we take from our axioms B, then we conjoin them using our rule of inference to A and B. Then we take C from the assumptions at the start of our proof, and conjoin that with our A and B to get A and B and C. However, with the same assumption, we can't prove A and B and D. as D is neither an axiom of the system nor an assumption we make. Similarly, A and B or C can't be proved because OR is not a connective we've specified we can use. You might wonder why we chose the connectives we did earlier and not a different set. Basically, it's because we wanted a system that would mirror how we think about logic in real life. In our day-to-day lives, we use connectives like and, or, if, then very frequently. Maybe not in specifically those ways, and we use a lot of other connectives which are very similar to them, but these are the connectives which underpin the way humans think about logic. To be sure, it would definitely be possible to come up with systems of logic using other connectives. In fact, it's possible to come up with systems of logic which use only one connective, which are able to prove everything that you can prove in our system, and that's really interesting. But we won't be talking about it here. Natural deduction is a system which emphasizes understandability over economy, and as such it has a few more connectives than we strictly need. I think now is a good time to introduce a key concept in the field of formal systems, that of consistency. A theory is inconsistent if there is a well-formed formula phi, for which both phi and not phi can be derived within the theory. A theory is consistent if it is not inconsistent. We like consistent theories because there's a little thing called the principle of explosion, which says that if there is a sentence such that both it and its negation can be proved, then you can prove any sentence you like within that system. It's called the principle of explosion because everything will blow up in your face. A consequence of this is that a theory is consistent if and only if there is a well-formed formula which cannot be proved. There only needs to be one. Typically there are more, but there only needs to be one. Our example theory from earlier is consistent because we were able to show that A and B and D cannot be proved despite it being well formed. This is an important equivalence to make, so store it away and we'll return to it later. Doors closing indeed. My favourite formal theory is the Hilbert system. It has two connectives, not and implication, 3 axioms on screen, and one inference rule, which says that if phi and phi implies psi, then psi. This is called modus ponens, meaning method of placing. Usually gets abbreviated to MP for implies. The Hilbert system can prove everything that natural deduction can, and vice versa, but the fact that there's only one inference rule makes the Hilbert system really cool for proving things. In particular, for the mathematicians among you, proofs by induction get really simple when you only have one inductive case to consider, whereas in natural deduction, there are, I think, something like 12 inference rules, and you have to consider every single case. It gets grueling if you're trying to do inductive proofs in natural deduction. So from now on, if I have to do a proof, which I may not actually have to, I can't remember in the video script, but if I do, I'm only going to bother proving things for the implication case, because natural deduction and the Hilbert system are equivalent, so we only need to consider the implication case. For the programmers among you, the Hilbert system is like C to natural deduction's Python. Much more difficult to understand, but once you're familiar with it, it's very quick.
Phew. I'm glad that's over. Although, Aristotelian syllogisms are statements of the form all x are y, A is x, therefore A is y. The most famous example of this is all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. But we can't do that in propositional logic. All men are mortal formalizes a propositional sentence A. Socrates is a man, propositional sentence B. Therefore, Socrates is mortal, propositional sentence C. So we would have to say that A and B together imply C, which is not a valid argument in propositional logic. We need to upgrade our logic. Which means... No, I don't want to go back! No!
Part 2.2. Predicate logic.
Alright, let's get it over with. Predicate logic is like propositional logic but better. Whereas with predicate logic, we could only consider WUFs in their entirety. Using propositional logic, you're allowed to break down formulae into their constituent parts.
Predicate logic is also called first-order logic. I think I forget to say this in this section of the video, and then from the end of this part onwards, I only ever call it first-order logic. So, just to clear up any confusion, predicate logic,
also called first-order logic. They're the same thing.
Well, I don't even get a suit this time. Basically, all of the definitions of propositional logic carry over. The major difference is that we introduce a concept called arity, which is a word I adore. I love the word arity. The arity of a predicate is the number of variables it admits. But what's a predicate? And what's a variable? These are very good questions, and one which I should probably have started with. Remember how propositional logic had proposition symbols which stood for whole sentences, like "it is raining" and "I will get wet"? Well, in predicate logic, we upgrade these to admit variables, which are terms with no fixed meaning. So for example, you could have a predicate symbol p of x, which we might notate p1 of x, to indicate that it has an arity of 1. This might be interpreted as something like x has property p, if we want to be very general. A specific case of this could be x is a dog, or x has a father, or x is mortal. Similarly, we could have b3 of x, y, and z, which would be a predicate symbol with 3 variables, which would mean that x, y, and z have property b. Or, more accurately, x, y, z has property b, because there's a technical detail here which is order matters. To discuss why this is the case, I'm going to have to talk briefly about interpretations. This will really come back later in the video. For now, I'm mostly just saying it to make a point. And the point is that the order in which your variables sit in the predicate symbol matters. So let's define p of x and y to be a binary predicate, which we can interpret as meaning x is greater than y. In this case, it's fairly obvious to see why we might like order to matter in predicate symbols. Because if order doesn't matter, then p of x and y would be equivalent to p of y and x. And if we want to interpret p as x is greater than y, then that would mean x is greater than y is equivalent to y is greater than x. So in order for the logic that we're about to build to make sense, it has to be such that the order of variables within predicate symbols matters. To make explicit something I've been hinting at, the arity of a predicate symbol is then the number of variables within it, or if you like, the number of letters that follow it. That means p of x is a 1-ary symbol, b of x, y, z is a 3-ary symbol, and our propositional symbols from earlier are 0-ary predicate symbols because they admit no variables. In this way, you can think of the predicate symbols as being a natural extension of the class of propositional symbols, if that's your thing. In addition to this, we have quantifier symbols. Now, these are the scary-looking logic symbols that you always see when you open textbooks, but they're really not that bad once you've met them and are familiar with them. If you've gone out for drinks a few times, maybe, I don't know, held their hand in a public place, they're really not that bad. The two that we have here are for all and there exists, upside down A and upside down E, respectively. Or I guess backwards A, no, upside down A, backwards E. Ooh. For all x, px can be understood to mean every x has property p. There exists an x such that px can be understood as some x has property p. If a variable is under the influence of a quantifier symbol, we say that that variable is bound. Otherwise, we say that it is free. For example, the predicate symbol that is currently on screen is bound in x and y and free in z. Alternatively, z is free, x and y are bound. We also introduce constant symbols, which can take the place of variables within predicates. These are like specific terms, as opposed to the more general idea of variables. We haven't yet given them meaning, as I keep saying, but what we can do is we can replace general variables with specific constants. So for example, px can be transformed into pa, but pa means specifically that a has property p, whereas p of x means x has property p, where x is not defined as a specific thing. Another way to think about it is that p of x has one free variable, whereas p of a has no free variables. Another thing you'll commonly see in formulations of first-order logic are so-called function symbols. Function symbols take variables to constants, and actually constants are a special kind of function symbol, but that's a bit technical and I won't get into it here. The idea is, in mathematics, functions represent a rule which take one number to another number. Function symbols in logic work much the same way, where you take a variable
and you transform it into another kind of variable, which we can interpret like a constant. Once again, I know I keep saying it, but hopefully this will all make more sense once we see examples. The formation rules for quantifiers are relatively easy. If you have a predicate symbol which is free in x, then you can slap a quantifier symbol on the front, so you can have for all x, p of x, and there exists x such that p of x. That is how you form them. Anything like that is well formed. You're also allowed to do this even if the predicate symbol does not contain the variable you are quantifying over. So, for all y, p of x is a well-formed formula. What it means, well, that's up for discussion really, but the point is that it's well-formed. This also works for propositional symbols, which, if you'll remember, are predicate symbols with arity 0. You can say, for all x, p. Again, doesn't really mean much, but you're allowed to do it. With these new tools, we can now formalize our Socrates argument. Let p of x mean x is a man, and q of x mean x is mortal. We'll then let a stand in for Socrates. The argument then becomes, for all x, px implies qx. pa, therefore, qa. We've dabbled a bit with meaning here, but I'd just like to illustrate to you an example of a valid argument in predicate logic. If you want some good material on the topic, I've got some books on screen that you might enjoy. This might feel a little bit rushed to you, and to be honest, that's because it is. Predicate logic is fascinating and a really fun thing to go and do some reading about yourself, but in order to get across the points in this video, I've had to restrict it only to things that are relevant to my proof of the Gödel theorems, which is really Fisher's proof, which is really Ross's proof. But either way, I'm not going to be able to give this subject the fair shake it deserves. I'd love to come back to it one day and maybe give a proper series on what exactly predicate logic holds in store for those of us who want to study it. But for now, I think it's time we just moved on, and I will refer to and clarify things as they come up. See you on the other side.
Everything we've talked about so far has been dealing with the syntax of formal languages, the so-called symbol shuffling, or symbolic calculus, if you're fancy. Aside from my examples, we haven't tried to give anything meaning yet, or even to try and work out when arguments are true or false. In order to do that, we'll need a method to determine whether sentences are true or false, which means it's time for...
Part 3. Syntax and Semantics.
It's time for semantics, models, and valuations. Semantics give meaning to sentences, which is done in the form of a structure. Structures have 4 parts. Logic seems to like 4s. You have a set of objects called the domain. These are the allowable values for variables, but they can be anything we like. You also have an interpretation of each n-place function as an ordered n-tuple, that's an ordered set of n elements, of the domain, mapping them to a single element of the domain. We also then have an interpretation of any n-place non-function predicate as being a set of ordered n-tuples of elements of the domain. And finally, we have an interpretation of each constant symbol as corresponding to a specific element of the domain. This is a technical, formal definition of a structure. If you don't follow the specifics, that's completely fine. You don't need to. I've mostly just included this for the hell of it. Having created a structure, we then perform a valuation on it, which assigns truth values, i.e. true or false, to each predicate. The idea behind this is we want to know whether certain predicates are true for a given set of inputs. Using our example from earlier, let's take the 2-place predicate symbol pxy to mean x is greater than y. And then we'll take the domain 1, 2, and 3. We could think of P as being a set of ordered pairs which satisfy the relation is greater than. So in our specific case, P would be given by 2, 1, 3, 1, and 3, 2. Because in each of those ordered pairs, the first element is greater than the second. Hence they satisfy the predicate P, and we can choose to define the predicate P in terms of this relation if we so wish. A predicate is true if and only if the input values are within the allowable set of input values. So for example, P of 2, 1 is true because 2 is greater than 1, whereas P 1, 2 is false because 1 is not greater than 2. We can define other predicates this way too. Over the same domain, the numbers 1, 2, and 3, let's define Q to be 1, 1, 2, 1, and 2, 3. Then Q 2, 1 would be true because 2, 1 is in the set of Q, whereas Q 1, 3 would be false because 1, 3 is not in the set Q. There's no special interpretation of Q in maths like there was of P. I created it just to be a reminder that what we're dealing here is very general and captures a lot of things that don't directly correspond to familiar mathematical objects.
From there, you can evaluate more complicated expressions by considering the connectives they contain. If phi and psi are both true, then phi and psi must also be true. But if psi is false, then phi and psi must also be false. However, phi or psi will be true. These connectives behave in the same way they do in ordinary language. We codify this in logic by using something called a truth table. For example, the truth table for OR shows us that phi or psi is false only in the case where both phi and psi are false. Of note here is the truth table for implies. It's only false in the case where a truth proves a falsehood. You might wonder why the bottom two entries evaluate as true. Well, it's our old friend the principle of explosion again in a new and improved form. If you assume a falsehood, you can prove anything. Therefore, if phi is false, then the expression automatically evaluates as true. Evaluating quantified predicates isn't much harder. Say you want to work out the truth value of for all x, px. The way you do this is to look at every element of the domain and see if px is true, or equivalently if x is in the set assigned to P by the structure. If so, for all x, px is true. If not, it's false. There exists an x such that px works the same way, where so long as there's one element of the domain in the set P, then you're good to go. For example, if we set P as x plus 1 equals 2, then, over the domain of integers, there exists an x such that px is true, but for all x, px is false. An interesting aside here is that certain WUFs have the same truth tables despite being made of different connectives. Take not phi and not psi. If we put the truth table for not phi or psi beside it, we see that they're the same. If this happens, we say that the sentences are functionally equivalent. Another example of truth functionally equivalent WUFs are phi implies psi and not phi and not psi. Although we can't use truth tables for quantifiers, a similar relationship holds for there does not exist an x such that p of x and for all x not p of x. In essence, we can push the not sign into the expression and change the quantifier. This will become important later. Using ideas like this, it's possible to formalize certain parts of maths such as group theory within first-order logic. Since we can interpret predicates however we like, it usually isn't very useful to prove general things about all predicates. More interesting things start to happen if we assume certain statements and only look at structures in which those statements are true. These statements, as well as the things you can derive from them, are called a theory.
A theory!
A model of a theory is any structure in which all of the statements in that theory are true. Hence we arrive at the notion of an axiomatic system. Assume axioms and see what happens. In other words, f*** around and find out. You f*** around with theories and find out with models. If this is hard to get your head around, hang on a bit and we'll look at an example in a little while. While you're constructing a theory, you're allowed to define certain special predicates with desirable quantities, and these predicates can be assigned their own unique symbols for ease of interpretation. The extra symbols used by a model are called its signature. These aren't standard symbols of first-order logic, but we can use them in place of instances of symbols of first-order logic. For example, let's take the predicate a of x and y, and assume that a of x and x is always true. If we also have that whenever x and y satisfy A, then phi equals phi prime for any sentence phi where phi prime is obtained from replacing every occurrence of x in phi with y, then A is what's known as logical equality. This represents the idea that if A of x and y holds, then whenever x shows up,
we can replace it with y, and the truth values of whichever sentences we've put it in will stay the same. It's the formal counterpart to the mathematical idea of the equals sign, and a of x and y is often notated as either x equals dot y or simply x equals y. The dot is meant to make it clearer that this is just another predicate symbol, albeit one with some special qualities. I'm going to stick to the undotted version. Also, from now on, I'm going to invoke x equals y, with this being understood as a special symbol of first order logic, with the above axiom taken for granted. Bear in mind that these are models of maths and are different from actual maths. There may be many different models which satisfy a given set of axioms. Also, the syntax is common to all of first order logic. It's the semantics which make the models work. Syntax and semantics are two completely different things, most of the time.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
Now I'd like to introduce two important logical
Part
concepts.
4. Soundness and completeness.
From now on, when I talk about a theory proving something, what I mean is it can be proved in first order logic with the axioms of the theory as assumptions. A theory that is sound has the property that anything it can prove is true within any model of that theory. In most theories, inconsistency implies unsoundness, as both phi and not phi cannot be true. A theory proving both of them means that the theory has proved something false, which is capital B bad. There are theories in which this isn't necessarily true, and those theories are super interesting, but they're a bit beyond the scope of this video. Completeness, on the other hand, is a property of an entire logic. It states that if a sentence is true in every model of a theory, then the sentence can be proved from that theory. We'll call this definition semantic completeness, as it deals with only the semantics or truth values of sentences. There is another definition which we'll get to in a moment. You might recognise these from the opening of the video, but I'd say just slow down, we'll get there when we get there. It's really easy to make a sound theory in predicate logic. It turns out that if you assume no axioms, the resulting theory is sound. I'll put the proof on screen, but the details don't really matter. All that matters is it's very easy to make sound theories. It's also very easy to make a complete theory. Take as an axiom phi and not phi for any sentence phi. The principle of explosion tells us that from this we can derive anything we like, including all true sentences. Of course, we get all the false ones as well, but completeness doesn't say anything about false sentences. All that matters is we can capture all the true ones. It's malicious compliance. This is why the Blacksmith says,
Of course.
and
There is nothing simpler.
at the beginning of the video. Because of course you can create sound theories, and there is almost literally nothing simpler than creating a consistent one. The difficulty comes if you want to find a theory that is both sound and complete. And as it turns out, both propositional and predicate logic are sound and complete. This is not an easy thing to prove, and indeed the completeness of first order logic was only first proved midway through the 20th century by a certain Mr. Kurt Gödel. So, if both propositional and predicate logic are sound and complete, where does incompleteness come into it? Well, remember how I mentioned there's another definition of completeness? Well, here it is. It's called syntactic completeness, and it states that for every well-formed formula phi, either phi or not phi can be proved within a theory. And it's this property that arithmetic is unfortunately lacking. Having finally acknowledged what this video is about, we're now going to take a hard left and start talking about something completely different.
Part 4 plus I. Paradoxes.
The word paradox, like a lot of words, has several different but similar meanings. You have linguistic paradoxes, which occur when language pulls tricks on us. For example, the following is a linguistic paradox. Nothing is better than eternal happiness. A ham sandwich is better than nothing, therefore a ham sandwich is better than eternal happiness. You have scientific paradoxes, which are when observations are made which contradict existing theories, such as Olber's paradox. If there are billions upon billions of stars in the night sky, then why aren't we being blinded by starlight in every direction? And you have the kind of paradoxes we're interested in, the logical paradoxes. These are statements which logically contradict themselves in some way.
Perhaps the most famous logical paradox is the liar paradox.
True. I'll go true. Yeah, that was easy. I'll be honest, I might have read that one before though. Saw it cheating.
We can render this in propositional logic as simply P implies not P, as if the sentence is true, P, then the sentence is false, not P.
Assuming P, we derive not P by modus ponens, and so by the principle of explosion our theory is inconsistent, as we can derive everything. This shows us that you can't derive the liar paradox in a consistent theory.
One could make the argument that the liar paradox is the only true logical paradox, and all other logical paradoxes are just different statements of that one paradox. Imagine a hairdresser who cuts the hair of only the people that don't cut their own hair. Should she cut her own hair? If so, then she cuts her own hair, and so by her logic she cannot cut her own hair. But if not, she does not cut her own hair, and so she may cut her own hair. This is called Russell's paradox, and once again it comes down to P implies not P. In this case, P is the barber cuts her own hair. Except when Russell found it, it was lurking in the depths of set theory, and he was too late to save it pouncing and devouring one Gottlob Frege. We also have Quine's paradox. Is false when it follows itself being quoted, is false when it follows itself being quoted. This is a sentence which cannot be true, as if it is true, then it must be false, since it has the structure which it asserts makes it false. You might feel like this is closer to being a linguistic paradox, and you're not wrong, but Quine's words echo through the proof of the incompleteness theorems in surprising ways, so it's worth mentioning here. All three of these paradoxes arise due to self-reference. The liar paradox directly asserts its own falsehood, Russell's paradox disallows certain kinds of sets, and Quine's paradox mirrors its own internal structure to give rise to a contradiction. Finally, let's look at something which claims to be a paradox and see if it really is. This is Richard's paradox, which is spelt Richard but pronounced Richard because he was a frog. Write down in a list every English phrase which unambiguously defines an arithmetic property. For example, is divisible by only itself and 1 would be on the list, as would is the sum of 3 cubes, but Apple Incorporated would not be on the list. If we number the list, it may be the case that the number of a property has that property. For example, if is an even prime was the second member of that list, then it would have the property it expresses since 2 is an even prime, whereas if is divisible by 5 was the third member of the list, then it would not have that property, since 3 is not divisible by 5. Call numbers which don't have the property assigned to them Richardian. In my earlier examples, 3 would be Richardian, but 2 would not be. Now, as being Richardian as a property of integers, it belongs on the list. If k corresponds to the property is Richardian, then is k Richardian? If so, by definition it is not. If not, then by definition it is. Is this a liar paradox again? Well, not quite. You see, I slipped something past you. I deceived you. You fools! Why did you think you could trust me? I am Loki, goddess of... Being Richardian is not an arithmetic property of integers. It is a meta-mathematical property, and so should not be listed at all. You can think of it this way. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is an arithmetic truth, but the word represented by the symbol 2 contains 3 letters, is not. 2 is Richardian is closer to the second than the first, as it describes a property of 2 which cannot be expressed in arithmetic, and so we can't count it among the arithmetic properties. Hence we can use the word meta-mathematical. Is Richardian is a property about mathematics, rather than of mathematics. The Greek word meta, as in metaphor, means above or over, and in that sense being Richardian is a property over arithmetic, rather than in arithmetic. If we were to expand the list of allowed statements to include meta-mathematical things like is Richardian, then we open the door to all kinds of trouble, including an infinite chain of false statements, one of which must be true. But what if there was a way to make is Richardian into an arithmetic property? Then it would have to appear on the list, and some version of Richard's paradox would apply. In order to do that, one would have to show that meta-mathematical properties of numbers could correspond to arithmetic properties. But how?
Part 5. What happens when you give numbers numbers?
Do you remember when we first met? It wasn't long ago. We'd both been invited to the same party by different people, and as we sat alone at the bar, our eyes locked. I could tell you were interested, but neither of us were willing to make the first move, until finally I leaned over to you and, over the humming throb of the music, whispered, "Did you know that you can formalize certain areas of mathematics using theories and models of first-order logic?"
At the beginning of the 20th century, a mathematician by the name of David Hilbert, of Hilbert system fame, wanted to go one step further. He wanted to find a complete formalization of all of mathematics. He wondered if you could find a finite set of axioms from which every single mathematical truth would follow. To this end, he founded Hilbert's program, which aimed to do exactly that. Find some way to represent mathematics in terms of a formal language, for which rules could be provided to generate proofs. Beginning in 1910, Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead published a 3-volume work called Principia Mathematica, which aimed to satisfy Hilbert's program by laying out a complete and rigorous formalization of the very basics of mathematical thought. We will find out in a moment whether or not Russell and Whitehead were successful in their aim to formalize all of mathematics, and whether Hilbert's program was indeed concluded with their work. But for now, let's turn our attention to a relatively small part of mathematics, namely arithmetic. When Gödel was working, the closest thing he had to a complete set of axioms for arithmetic, the field of maths associated with positive whole numbers being manipulated by elementary operations, were the Peano axioms. These simple statements of logic seemed as though they might be comprehensive enough to allow us to derive every arithmetic truth. The axioms are pretty dry, which is why in order to spice things up a little I've decided to rank them. But before we get into that, I need to set the scene, as we'll be meeting some familiar symbols in new contexts. Peano arithmetic uses all of the standard symbols of first-order logic, plus 4 special ones, less than or equal to, plus, times, and successor. The less than or equal to symbol is a predicate, as discussed earlier, whereas the successor is a unary function, which means it takes one input and points to one element of the domain. And plus and times are both binary functions, which means they take 2 inputs and point to one element of the domain. Strictly speaking, we don't need custom symbols for them, as their properties will be defined in the axioms. We could, if we wanted, simply notate them P, F1, F2, and F3 respectively, but it's easier to understand what the axioms mean when they're filled in with the familiar symbols, plus we aren't breaking any rules by doing it, so why not? We also have one constant symbol, which we notate as 0 bar. The idea behind this is that we're giving 0 bar the properties of 0, but in order to distinguish it from the number 0, we add the bar over the top, to reinforce that it is in fact still a symbol. It's a bit like the dot over the equals sign from earlier, reminding us that this is just a symbol, and any properties it may have will be given in the axioms rather than inherent to the object itself. It's axiom time, baby! That's so stupid. We are going to rank the 13 Peano axioms. 13 Peano axioms. Some formulations of them have fewer, some formulations of them have more. I've split them up into 13 for the purposes of making it very clear what each axiom is doing. And I will be ranking them based on more or less just how I feel about them. There's no rhyme or reason to this except for number 1, which has been chosen for a very specific reason. Now before I begin, I should explain the 3 different colours. If I'm writing in red, I'll either be defining the properties of the 0 symbol or of the greater than or equal to symbol. Hi, future me here in the editing bay, just to say that I mean the less than or equal to symbol. Apologies for any confusion caused, I'm going to get it right from here on out, I promise you. Also, I only realised that the whiteboard wasn't in focus after I'd finished filming everything. I really can't be bothered to go back and film it all again, so instead, I'm going to edit clean versions of each axiom on screen as they're introduced in the video, which should hopefully make things easier to understand. Back to the video! If I'm writing in black, I will be defining the properties of the addition symbol. And if I'm writing in blue,
I will be defining the properties of the multiplication symbol. Got that? Okay, let's hit the road with the very bottom of the list. Crashing into last place in number 13, we have this property of the less than or equal to symbol, which says that if x is less than or equal to y, it is also the case that either x is y or the successor of x is less than or equal to y. So this is basically just allowing for the equals sign, the lower line in the symbol. If we didn't have this axiom, then we could define it to simply be the strictly less than symbol. But because of this equals clause here, we get the less than or equal to symbol instead. What's next? In at number 12, we have this property of the successor function, which I forgot to add to my key, but we're going to lump in black with the and symbol. This basically says that if the successor of a number is equal to the successor of another number, then those two numbers are the same. It's a fairly standard property of equality, and we define it here to give some rigor to the successor function and to equality. This is mostly a workhorse axiom. We've yet to get to anything really interesting, I think. So let's move on to number 11. At number 11, another workhorse function defining an essential property of the less than or equal to sign, which says that if x is less than or equal to y and y is less than or equal to x, then x must be equal to y. These are just defining standard properties of the symbols at this point. Again, things will start to get interesting soon, I promise you. I'm trying to do this bit just to liven up what would otherwise be me narrating a list of axioms. So, on to number 10. Number 10 is where I think we start to get to some of the interesting axioms, because we've now defined one of the many properties of 0, which says that 0 is less than or equal to every number. Now, when I write the x here, when I say all x, we are quantifying over the domain of numbers or numerical symbols. So what this is saying is that if x is a number, then 0 is less than or equal to x. Pretty cool property. Not the last we're going to see of 0 for sure. Number 9 marks the first appearance of our blue pen, which says that if you multiply any number by 0, the result is 0. Very standard property of 0. Cool that we get to define it like this. Let's move on. In at number 8, the first appearance of the black pen, defining the mirror property of 0 for multiplication for 0 for addition, which says that if we add 0 to any integer, we get that same integer. This is because 0 is the additive identity of the group of integers. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you add it to any number, you get the same number back. It is identity. It defines an identity. You get the picture. Number 7 is the final 0 axiom. It says that no number comes before 0. We're not including negative numbers because negative numbers make life very difficult when you're trying to define arithmetic. There are ways to do it. You can formulate group theory using a different set of axioms and use that to define inverse elements for the additive group of the integers. Those work as negative numbers. We're not going to worry about them here. For now, just take it. This is an axiom. Just take it. That 0 is the first number. It is the first number. It was there before all the others. It's also, interestingly, the only numeral we need, because we can just use the successor function iterated on itself over and over again to define any number we like. But I'll talk more about that later. Number 6, the transitive property of the less than or equal to sign, says that if x is less than or equal to y and y is less than or equal to z, then x is less than or equal to z as well. This defines what we call an ordering on the set of integers. It's this property that allows the less than or equal to symbol to have all of the nice features that we expect it to have, like bigger numbers should be less than smaller numbers, other way around, like smaller numbers should be less than bigger numbers, things like that. This is a very cool property, very neatly defined, and yeah. Number 5, either x is less than or equal to y or y is less than or equal to x. Has to be one of the two. One of them's got to happen. Which one? Who knows? All this axiom says is that one of them has to obtain. This makes sense, right? Because if we have 2 and we have 3, then we can't say, oh, 2 isn't less than or equal to 3, but 3 isn't less than or equal to 2. By our understanding of the less than or equal to symbol, one of them has to obtain. This is the axiom that allows that to happen.
Coming in at a very respectable 4th, just shy of the podium, still not bad at all. For all x, x is less than or equal to x. This makes sense. 2 is less than or equal to 2 because 2 is equal to 2. Equal to implies less than or equal to. That conforms with our understanding. I'll edit that, that'll sound better. We have arrived at the podium, and immediately I'm faced with a problem, because I can't decide between 3rd and 2nd place, because they define basically the same property for addition and for multiplication correspondingly. And here they are. Addition. X plus y plus 1 is equal to x plus y plus 1. 2 plus 3 is equal to 2 plus 2 plus 1. Likewise, x times y plus 1 is equal to x times y plus x. 5 times 7 is equal to 5 times 6 plus 5. And with that, there's only one axiom left. Or is there? Because in number 1, the pole position, the gold medal, we have the induction schema. Now, this is an especially tricky axiom because it is actually an infinite set of axioms. So, to explain in further detail, I'm going to pass you over to future me on the bed. Over to you!
While almost all of the axioms of Peano arithmetic can be written in first-order logic, plus some extra symbols in the signature, there is an exception. There's a principle in mathematics called induction. You know, if a unary predicate of integers is true for naught, and its truth for some number k implies its truth for k plus 1, then every positive integer satisfies that predicate. The way we express that in logic requires us to assert that any predicate which obeys this rule holds for all x in our domain, but we aren't allowed to quantify over predicates in first-order logic. So, if we want to stay in the first order, we need to create an infinite set of axioms, one for each unary predicate, which says that if it has this property, or these two properties required for induction, then it holds for every element of the domain. You may be a bit worried that we're having to invoke infinity here, but it turns out we actually don't have anything to worry about, because the infinite set of axioms that we have is countable and recursively enumerable. Recursively enumerable simply means it can be listed by an algorithm, and countable means there's a bijection between it and the natural numbers. There's a great Vsauce video on the different kinds of infinity, which I'll link in the card up there. The key fact of these axioms is that they use finitely many symbols, and as such, there are only finitely many symbols you need to use to express any proposition of arithmetic. And it's this, combined with many other things, that allows us to break mathematics wide open.
As there are finitely many symbols in first-order logic, we can assign each symbol a unique number. Note that there are infinitely many ways to do this, but the way we're going to do it is adapted from the lecture notes on the course I took on this material. To represent symbols unique to arithmetic, in this case plus, times, and less than or equal to, we're going to use this tick operator and put it next to either the function symbol or the predicate symbol. This means that plus will be rendered as f prime, times will be rendered as f double prime, and less than or equal to will be rendered as equals prime. We might also like to have number symbols other than 0. To do this, we represent the number symbol n by the number symbol 0 followed by exactly n successor symbols. Using this, it's possible to assign each collection of symbols a unique number as well, by simply concatenating the numbers of the individual symbols. I keep stressing this uniqueness factor because it's very important in logic that every logical theorem should have a unique way of being understood. There should be no syntactic ambiguity. There is a theorem of logic called the unique readability theorem, which states that this is the case, and we want to preserve it under our map of Gödel numberings. In this way, every base 13 number containing no zeros corresponds to a collection of symbols of first-order logic. However, not every collection of symbols will be well-formed. In the case that the string of symbols is well-formed, we call the number corresponding to that string a woof number. Or rather, I will be calling them that. I don't believe this is standard terminology. I'm going to be a bit sloppy with my notation, and allow sentence variables to refer to both sentences and the Gödel numbers of those sentences. It should always be clear from context whether I'm talking about the sentence or the Gödel number associated with it, but where possible I'm going to take pains to make it explicitly clear which one I'm referring to. In this way, every woof has its own unique Gödel number, whether that woof is true, false, or otherwise. Examples are shown on screen. One final point to note is that we may wish to encode sequences of woofs. The way we do this is with our hash symbol. We take each woof, add a hash after it, and then concatenate them all together. If we then take the Gödel number of this, the result is the woof numbers of each individual woof, broken up by the Gödel number of our hash symbol, which otherwise will not appear in any woof. This way we ensure that each Gödel number of a sequence of woofs cannot correspond to the Gödel number of a single woof. For those of you keeping track at home, the Gödel numbering map from the natural numbers to sentences of logic is injective but not surjective.
Part 5.1. Gödel's first in...
Aha! I knew it! Who are you?
Wait, you can hear me?
Yes?
You aren't meant to be able to hear me.
I've been able to hear you this entire time.
No, I mean, you're going to edit me in later. I'm recording this on a different continent to you right now.
That doesn't change the fact that I can still hear you.
But I can't hear you.
Wait, then how are you talking to me?
I'm following the script you gave me.
Oh,
Very meta. Anyway, if we're done here...
Not yet. I still don't know why I can hear you.
Katie, this bit's gone on long enough. Why don't you... Ow! That hurt!
Huh, so if I hit myself, you feel it?
Yeah, so don't do it again, you dick. But if I'm following your script, how did I feel that pain?
I don't know.
All right, just carry on with what you were going to talk about. And leave me out of it.
It may not be immediately obvious, but Gödel numberings are extremely powerful. As an example, let's look at a few metalogical properties of woofs and see if we can express them using Gödel numbers. First of all, let's consider the property the woof phi is 5 characters long. There is absolutely no way to express this in only the language of first-order logic. However, if we assign phi a Gödel number, then the length of phi is related to the length of the Gödel number of phi, which in turn is expressible as an arithmetic property of the Gödel number of phi. In this case, that the Gödel number of phi is between 13 to the power of 4 and 13 to the power of 5. We can then express this as a woof of first-order logic as shown. For another example, let's look at a syntactic property of phi, namely, the woof phi is a negation. We might try something along the lines of, there exists no woof phi such that psi is equal to the negation of phi. But this is not allowed, since we can't quantify over sentences in first-order logic. Instead, note that phi must begin with a negation symbol if it is to be a negation. Therefore the Gödel number of phi must begin with the Gödel number of the negation symbol, which in this case is a 1. This can then be expressed as a numerical property of the Gödel number of phi, as shown. Here we've had to invoke knowledge of the length of phi, but from our first example, this can be demonstrated within first-order logic, so we don't need to worry about it too much. This property may also be expressed as a woof of first-order logic. Note that this generalizes very easily to the woof phi beginning with an arbitrary character. And we can also extend it to the woof phi beginning with an arbitrary collection of characters, although this is a little more complicated. This can generalize further to allow us to express properties of whether or not woofs contain certain symbols at certain locations. As before, we can generalize this even further to the woof phi has an arbitrary collection of symbols beginning at an arbitrary position, and this is extremely significant.
Oh, Oh, I get it. I'm like the semantics and you're like the syntax. Normally the relationship only goes one way, but under the right circumstances, you can affect me.
Sort of. The syntax and the semantics are to a certain extent already in that relationship. That's soundness and completeness. But what we've shown is that we can transform the syntactic rules of the system into arithmetic rules for the Gödel numbers, which means we can express both syntactic and semantic claims in terms of properties of the Gödel numbers. I guess it's more like you're the theory and I'm the Gödel numbers.
Well, I'm glad we've sorted that out. Can I go now?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
You owe me £75 for this, by the way.
You volunteered! These are just a few examples of metalogical properties being converted into arithmetic properties of the Gödel numbers of sentences. These have been included to be illustrative, they are not comprehensive, and I have skimmed over a lot of detail here, but I just wanted to give an overview of some applications of the Gödel numberings. Using the techniques I've illustrated, it's also possible to arithmetrize the statement that a sequence of woofs begins with a given woof or contains a given woof in an arbitrary position in that sequence. This will also be very important momentarily. The natural question is then, are there more properties that can be arithmetrized using Gödel numberings? And the answer is a resounding yes, there are. Try this one on for size. X proves Y, i.e. there is a proof of the woof Y which uses only the woof X as an axiom. I'm switching away from Greek letters for my own sanity. Note that this is sufficient to cover all axiomatic systems, including ones with multiple axioms, as a set of axioms can be formed into one conjunct which can be pruned as necessary. For example, if the set X, X1 proves Y, then X and X1 also proves Y. I'm going to take it as read that it's possible to remove conjuncts, because it will make my life easier. Recall that we can encode the sequence X, Y as X hash Y, and the theory has a finite set of deduction rules, in a Hilbert system, 1, which operates syntactically. If we take as our axiom X, then a proof of Y from X is given by X hash Z hash Y, where Z is a sequence of woofs representing the deductive steps to get from X to Y. We can use our sequence begins with X and sequence ends with Y from earlier to check that the sequence really does begin with X and end with Y. As we have a finite set of deduction rules, we can also check the Gödel numbers of the elements of Z to make sure that they are either axioms, assumptions, or can be deduced from them using set deduction rules. Using modus ponens as an example, to check if a Gödel number corresponds to X implies Y, all you need to do is show that it begins with X, ends with Y, and has an 8 in between. We can therefore render the statement X proves Y as a property of the Gödel numbers of X and Y. This is huge and gives another sense of the power of Gödel numbers, as to formalize the notion of an arithmetic proof within arithmetic itself is hugely significant. We'll write proves xy for the woof corresponding to the assertion the sentence with Gödel number x proves the sentence with Gödel number y, i.e. x proves y. And for a set of assumptions S, we write proves sub S x y for x proves y assuming S. Note that this can be true or false. It's simply a statement saying x proves y. It doesn't mean that x does prove y. Remember that we capture false statements as well as true ones with Gödel numberings. Using this, we can now state in more general terms the idea of provability and unprovability in Peano arithmetic. There exists an x such that prove sub PA xy means y is provable in Peano arithmetic. Likewise, for all x, it is not the case that prove sub PA xy means y is not provable in PA. Now I said earlier we couldn't range over woofs, but what we can do is range over the numbers which represent the woofs under our Gödel numbering. This is like the one weird trick that doctors hate, except for logic. Also note that we can formalize the opposite of y is provable in PA by combining proves PA with z is the negation of y, which we showed earlier. I will notate this as proves sub PA x not y, which is an abuse of notation, but I do not care. We also want some manner of self-reference. Remember that the paradoxes from earlier all relied on being able to assert things about themselves. So let's define a new predicate, PR sub PA xy, short for proof recursion. This is true when x is the Gödel number of a formula xa with one free variable, and y is the Gödel number of a proof of xx. This means that we are feeding x its own Gödel number and then trying to prove it. I know it's weird, but go with it. This self-substitution operation is also definable within Peano arithmetic. It simply says, if the kth digit of the Gödel number of a woof is equal to b, then replace it with the numeral representing the Gödel number of that woof. We then combine it with proves sub PA to get the desired result. This allows us to craft sentences which can assert things about themselves. For example, this statement is 3 characters long corresponds to the Gödel number of this statement is 3 digits long. From earlier, we defined x as 3 digits long as a predicate zx in Peano arithmetic with Gödel number z, and then we can consider z of z, which is false. We now have everything we need to formulate incompleteness in first-order logic. Now, I'm not going to be following Gödel's original argument. I will instead be pursuing Ross's amended version of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which makes it a little more obvious where the contradiction lies. However, I will just take a moment to lay out what Gödel did. Gödel's Gödel sentence expressed that it was only provable if it was false, which, if you'll remember, is a capital B, capital T bad thing. This is what I was talking about at the very beginning of the video. Someone, the Gödel sentence, exists who, if they are your enemy, true, cannot be killed by your sword, cannot be proved in the theory, and if they can be killed by your sword, can be proved in the theory, then they are not your enemy, false. Our argument is adapted from Alec Fisher's Formal Number Theory and Computability, which is a great book and I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in this area. What we're going to do is formulate a sentence which asserts its unprovability within the theory, and then add something to it. And then we're going to show that if we can prove this sentence, it implies some bad things about the consistency of arithmetic. It's easy to create a woof saying that x cannot be proved within PA. From before, for all y, it is not the case that proves sub PA yx corresponds to x is not provable. Let's make 2 slight amendments to this statement. Let's replace proves sub PA with PR sub PA, and add in this additional clause. Now the woof says either x of x is not provable, or there exists a proof of the converse of x of x. Or in other words, if x of x is provable, then so is not x of x. Let's call this woof g of x, noting that it has exactly one free variable x. As this is a woof, it must have a Gödel number. Let's call this Gödel number lowercase g. Now let's take g of g, and this is the sentence which breaks maths. From a metalogical perspective, this sentence means either this statement is not provable, or you can prove the opposite of this statement. Intuitively, you can see the contradiction. If you can prove g of g, then you can prove not g of g, which violates the assumption of consistency. However, this isn't a formal proof, and I can't give you a formal proof. The best I can do is a neat little animation showing you Fisher's argument, which is a little more rigorous than what I've presented, but still not quite as formal logic demands. It's going to use everything we've talked about so far, in particular the functional equivalence relations I brought up during my talk about semantics. If you're interested in following along, Pause and stop as necessary. The full proof will be on screen at the end of each section. So sit back and enjoy the first incompleteness theorem. This is pretty bad, but don't worry, it gets worse. Before we begin, one thing to note while the first section is still fresh in our minds. For all x, ax implies for all x, ax or bx. This is important, because the latter half of this is the form of g of g. Therefore, if we can prove the first half of this statement, then we will have proved g of g by disjunction. What we showed before was that if Peano arithmetic is consistent, then g of g is unprovable. Both parts of this statement can be formalised inside of Peano arithmetic using Gödel numberings. Remember from earlier that an equivalent condition for consistency is that there is at least one well-formed formula of the language that is unprovable. So let's take 1 equals 0 as that thing and consider the formula 1 equals 0 and x equals x. This is a formula with one free variable x. Let's call this formula c of x, with Gödel number c. Consistency is then equivalent to saying that there is no proof of c of c within Peano arithmetic, which can be formalised using our proof recursion method. We also have g of g is unprovable, as simply, for all y it is not the case that PR sub PA g of y. Therefore, we may formalise our earlier argument as follows. Now let's think about what would happen if we could prove that Peano arithmetic is consistent using only the axioms of Peano arithmetic. If this were the case, we'd be able to prove the first half of our implication on screen. But then we'd be able to use modus ponens to deduce the second part. But from earlier, notice that the second part implies g of g. Since we proved earlier that you can't prove g of g within Peano arithmetic, it follows that you can't prove the first half of the implication,
which means that you can't use Peano arithmetic to prove that Peano arithmetic is consistent. To put it another way, we would only be able to prove Peano arithmetic is consistent if it isn't.
It would be remiss of me not to talk a little bit about some common misconceptions about the Gödel theorems. For example, something that's commonly said about them is that you require a system stronger than Peano arithmetic to prove Peano arithmetic's consistency. This is not true. Gerhard Gentzen showed that Peano arithmetic is consistent if you assume the consistency of another system, which is no less or more powerful than Peano arithmetic. So, when people say that Peano arithmetic requires a stronger system to prove its consistency, that's not quite true. Furthermore, and this is a detail I kind of skipped over for time, all the Gödel theorems state is that if you have a system whose axioms can be listed algorithmically, then it must be incomplete. It says nothing about the completeness of systems whose axioms can't be listed algorithmically, and so for that reason, while Hilbert's program might have failed, mathematics as a whole has nothing to fear. And some great things came out of Hilbert's program. His Principia Mathematica, though flawed, contributed some great ideas to the development of logic in the latter half of the 20th century, so it definitely wasn't a waste of time, and we certainly shouldn't set fire to it. Actually, hang on. And just in case you were worried I would actually burn a copy of Principia Mathematica, it's just this instead. And although arithmetic has proved particularly difficult to formalize, we have very good formalizations for other areas of mathematics. For example, ZF set theory, Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, is very good and forms the basis for a lot of ongoing efforts in formalization and axiomatization to this day. So there's absolutely nothing to worry about. You can stop worrying! Please, people, stop saying maths is over. Maths is not cancelled. Cancel culture has not come for maths yet. It will. Especially when it finds out, like, two of the most prominent logicians in the field were just Nazis.
Warning! We are about to enter the opinion zone. Everything from this point onwards is merely my own opinion, and you should feel free to agree or disagree with it at your leisure. You have been warned.
One final comment, just because it annoys me slightly when people do this. People love to bring up the Gödel Incompleteness theorems as an example of why human brains could never be modelled by computers. Roger Penrose has written over 2 books on this matter, and I just don't see it. Like, sure, maybe human brains can't be simulated by a computer, we may never know. The Chinese room argument is a great rebuttal as to why not. But I don't think you can say, oh, just because some things in arithmetic can't be proved within recursively enumerated axiomatized systems, then human brains can't be simulated by a computer. It doesn't follow. And, like, I get their arguments. So, for those of you who haven't read the material, I'm skimming over quite a lot here. People make the argument that Gödel's incompleteness theorems show that you can't prove everything using formalized systems of arithmetic, which is wrong, as I've just said, but we move on. Then people say, but humans can prove meta-mathematical results about formal systems. Therefore, humans are better than computers, because apparently computers can only prove things in axiomatic systems. That's why algorithmically enumerable axiom sets are important, because we love computers. We like computers to be able to check our work, and there are many, many programs out there that run theories of logic on them and can tell you whether they're consistent, whether they're complete, whether certain things can be proved in them. But I don't think you can take that to mean that human brains are necessarily something other than fuzzy biological computers. But anyway, I've gone off script here. There are many better videos and essays, and video essays, about this than the one I'm currently making, and this has gone on long enough already. So all that remains is for me to thank everyone who's contributed to this video. Their names were listed at the beginning. Go back and check them out if you haven't already. And to say thank you for sticking with me. This has been the biggest thing I've ever done, and I hope something comes of it, even if it's not in this summer of math exposition. Maybe in the future? I'd love to come back and talk a little bit more about formal logic, so if you'd like that, like, subscribe, leave a comment.
Feels weird to say this. It's the first time I've ever said it. But, yeah. I hope you enjoyed. Bye.